Okay. All right. So I'll put it here somewhere. All right. So. Oh yeah, that's right. I will wait until they wandered off someplace. And let's see, how do I shift forward? I have to walk over and do that, I suppose. Yeah. So, don't. Hello there. Yep. Marco is on his way.
So I think we can start.
Yes.
It's my pleasure to welcome Claes Andersson, who is in this new seat of ECLT. In fact, this is the first seminar that ECLT is organizing in this place. I think we should close the door.
Let's do that. Grazie.
So, Claes is a professor of complex system and at the University of Charles, let me write exactly, Charles University of Technology in Gothenburg in Sweden, but he's also a fellow of ECLT. In fact, he contributed and participated to the research activity of ECLT just from the beginning, even before ECLT started. And so it's our pleasure to have you here to give this talk about.
Oh, yeah.
Protocell hypothesis, the new approach to human, social, cultural evolution. Please start.
So thank you for having me here. So I will talk a bit here about, well, a new idea about approaching human evolution and cultural evolution. I know some of you are familiar with protocells and in their original setting. Here we have one. I don't know, maybe it differs a little bit. I'm going to just outline also that a little bit. I mean, as you may know, human evolution is something we've been interested in for ages. It's one of those existential questions where we come from and everything like that. And over the past few decades, really, we have gained a lot more empirical knowledge about the past. One component of that is the realization that we are very closely related to the chimpanzees that we can study today. And as a result of this, we also have started to study chimpanzees in great detail, which beginning in the 70s really, and it took a couple of decades to really start doing that, because it's not the easiest thing to do to study chimpanzees in the wild. And lately we're learning more and more and more, and we're also learning more and more from genetics and from archaeological and from paleontological traces, and a lot of things are happening in that way. But there is a problem in piecing everything together theoretically, because without a theoretical frame to keep it all together, you only get a bunch of facts. It's just one damn thing after another. So everything is just a long sequence. So that's where this idea comes in. It's a theoretical idea about an enveloping theoretical idea that can subsume and reinterpret a lot of the other theoretical ideas that are around. So I'm not sure if I will jump directly to this, or maybe depending on the pre-knowledge, if I just say something about the general setting of this, I can place it in time a little bit. We're talking about things happening between 2.5 and say 5 million years ago. At the time where our predecessors, and we don't know exactly which ones they are, but we have our suspicions, they were Australopithecines, we know that, exactly which species, etc. We don't know exactly. Around this time there was a transition that began into the forms that we taxonomize as Homo, the genus Homo. Which is heralded to begin with a larger brain and a couple of other features that accelerate later on. But to begin with, we actually were quite like the chimps. About 5 to 7 million years ago, we share a common ancestor with the chimpanzees. We know that the chimpanzees haven't changed very much in the time between. There are not an awful lot of traces of fossil chimpanzees, but they turn up a little bit here and a little bit there. And we know that there were lots of great apes around at that time. And they all, I mean, generic great apes. And some of them bipedal, we call them hominins, depending on how we define hominins, but in our ancestral lineage. Great apes in general are extractive foragers. Smart, they have a high technological intelligence. This means that they are trying to get to resources that others can't get to by using tools and smart techniques and doing stuff like that. Chimpanzees and humans are also quite social. They have a social organization, which a lot of other great apes lack. Like orangutans, for example, they're pretty much solitary. They're very highly individuated, the great apes, and they have troubles keeping together. We share a kind of social organization that I will talk more about here. That is first of all called a fission-fusion system, which we share with a lot of other wolves and things like that, which pretty much is that you defend a territory and you want to be present across this territory to defend it the whole time, and you don't want to put too much pressure on it. So you form small subgroups and you move about constantly, and you meet and you split up and merge and do all things like that. But the difference here is that there is a negotiated order the whole time. We don't have a genetic way of generating these groups. In most primates, there will be a matrilineal generation of the groups in a dominance hierarchy where you just slot in the daughter below the mother the whole time. And then they fight and get aggressive and try to resolve their differences. But they always return to this genetically defined structure. And when it gets too large so they can't do it, then it just splits off and you have two groups instead. The chimps are different and humans are different in this. We keep track of each other. We know each other personally, and we also know the relations between the others in the group. And this puts a tremendous cognitive strain on us, which means that as the groups become larger, we have a harder and harder time to resolve the conflicts that arise, and eventually there will be a dynamics kicking off where the group will split in two, but it happens in a different way. So we can see that this type of course, this cannot be observed directly in the deep past, but there are various indications that it has been like that the whole time. That has been the general theme of how we have been organized. There are certain major differences between how humans and chimps are organized, of course, also qualitatively, that we are that we build male-female pairs and things like that, which they don't. There are lots of differences like that. But in outline, we have a similar way of organizing, which makes them useful to as a model species, but we should be cautious, of course, because it can be a little bit too convenient. But that positions us somewhere in time and roughly what we're talking about. So the social protocell hypothesis, it begins from noting a similarity, a very abstract similarity between the origins of cellular life and the origins of humans, and actually the way that chimps still work, but nothing has happened there. So let's look at what this says in the context of protobiont protocells in the beginning of life, and now we're talking more than 4 billion years back. The best model, so to say, of what took place back then. Okay, so we have a primordial situation where we have RNA molecules. RNA molecules, they have the peculiarity that they can produce copies of themselves. They auto-catalyze into new copies. A sequence of bases, and also this sequence of bases corresponds to a three-dimensional form, so they have an enzymatic capacity at the same time. So the informational and the interactional characteristics are linked. So you can get an evolutionary situation going in this setting. Of course, not a whole lot can happen. For one thing, they can't get very long because they will lose information because they have a low replication fidelity. They will make errors and you can't preserve a particularly long sequence. But there are potentialities here that are impossible to foresee by just looking at the RNA molecules. And one of these is that in doing what they are doing, one thing that they could do in this chemistry is to produce phospholipids, which is what our cell membranes are constituted by. Okay, so under certain circumstances, there will be a spontaneous formation of a little bubble, which will tend to contain whatever produced the bubble, so they will end up inside the bubble. Okay, The bubble is permeable to nutrients. They can get in, so small molecules can get through, but the big RNAs, they can't get out, and these chemical cycles, they can't get out, so they're trapped in there. And then it also just happens, because this is not adapted, it's, as they sometimes call it, pre-adapted. It just happens to, there's a separate explanation for it, in this case a chemical explanation for it. When they grow and they do what they are doing, they produce phospholipids, they enter the membrane, it grows, and eventually it destabilizes, and it splits into 2 vesicles instead. And also, as a coincidence, this will cause them to inherit whatever was inside them before, so you have a pre-adapted inheritance taking place. And conceivably, what happens here, if you have chemical cycles here that are more efficient and are better than others at producing these phospholipids, then they will grow faster, they will have a higher fecundity on the macro level, and they will, so evolution has moved to a new level. And you can do a lot more with these cellular structures and combinations of replicators, interactors inside here than you can do with them singly. And that is something that is a common theme that goes through the major evolutionary transitions, where you have an evolutionary transition in individuality. The evolutionary individual moves, transitions from a micro level to a macro level, and new things become possible on the new level. Then a lot of things happen, but this is like the start of it. You have a coincidental thing going on that just happens to propel it to a different level. Okay. And then I had made some sort of silly thing there. Okay. Okay, the proto-sociont protocell. So sociont, I don't think I have that in the title or anywhere. So the sociont, it plays on the biont, which is an old taxon that's not used anymore for all living things. So the sociont is a social body. Just a way of indicating that there is a similarity there and also a very strong difference. So we have the communities that I talked about before. I will just go through this very briefly now, because it will go into a little bit more detail later on here. But we have social networks of hominins here, or chimpanzees, because they work like this roughly as well. The social networks, they are very tight within the communities, but they are very sparse between. Actually, in the common chimpanzee, you will have no connections in between, almost. I mean, young females will transfer to other communities, but they are poor vectors of any information, because they are conformist. So if one individual turns up and one low-ranking individual, young low-ranking individual, they are not likely to pick up very much from this individual. It does happen that they do, but it's rare. You have much weaker connection between the communities than in between them. So you don't have a barrier, but you have a lack of bridges between them instead, which means that their traditional behavior cannot travel. So the traditional behavior, it is something that is turned out to be quite widespread among animals, and especially among extractive foragers that are intelligent and have intricate ways of doing things, and where finding out about how to get to a certain resource is actually worth quite a bit. Then they will engage in social learning, will observe what somebody else does and try to do something similar. And when you do this, and they are of different ages, these ways of doing it will travel through generations and form traditions. And there you have the potentiality of an evolutionary situation to arise. It doesn't always or necessarily happen. It doesn't even have to be adaptive. It's just a by-effect of social learning across generation in its simplest forms. But chimpanzees, they have a lot of traditions, hundreds literally that have been described. And if we count very simple ones like social conventions and things like that, it's a big soup of it. It's also known that they are different between different communities. It doesn't travel between communities. It has been analyzed quite in detail. So there is the potential here that the traditions with a positive fitness contribution to the ones that possess them can contribute to population growth. It doesn't seem to be that way in chimps to any greater extent. They are useful, but it's not like in humans that we rely on them completely. But there might be slight positive effects on fitness. Okay, so, but imagine we have a bigger effect. So what can happen is that, okay, this will cause the community to grow. And what happens when it grows is that eventually it splits. And when it splits, it will also inherit the traditions that are contained within. So we have a kinetics on this level that is very similar to what we had in the proto-biont protocell situation. So then, of course, the idea here is that we might be able to use some of the theoretical lessons from understanding macroevolution to understanding the evolution of ourselves and our cultural systems. So then I will go with some preliminaries here. I will go to some statements that are true for both types of protocellular kinetics. First of all, we start all the way down, and that shows an abstract little container containing some micro-level evolutionary individuals that are undergoing evolution, some little population there. So the macro-level proto-EI, which is about to become an evolutionary individual in itself, the bubble, it is a compartment that contains primitive micro-level EI. Okay, so micro-level growth is coupled directly to macro-level growth. So if they grow on the micro-level, then the macro-level also grows. So there is a coupling between them. It's still perfectly additive. It's nothing specific happening, but it's still just shadowing the micro level, but it's acting there and it can potentially take off at some point. So macro level fecundity is also pre-adapted and coupled to growth because it results from growth. So you have something taking place on the micro level that causes something on the macro level to happen, and what happens on the macro level is something that is sufficient in principle to kick off evolution on a higher level. And we also get macro level heredity, which is also pre-adapted. In the case of the apes, it's a matter of that all the individuals will be likely to possess roughly the same knowledge, roughly the same traditions, because the traditions travel very easily within the community. So when you split it up, both of them will have pretty much the same, on average, the same knowledge. So these are some of the things that we can say in both cases here. So let's look a little bit more in detail what is going on here. Yes? Please interrupt.
You are creating this analogy between the cell
yes.
and the social community.
Yes.
Individuals. And the first step in the cell case, you have single cell that replicates itself. Is it?
Yes, in the first macro level, on the macro level, yes.
On the other side, when you look at a social setting, you start with just in one individual, or?
Well, you started with a you have a community, and then the community splits.
Okay, starting point is a community.
A community, okay. Yes. And that's what I'm going to get into here, because what corresponds to the RNA, it's not an ape that corresponds to the RNA. It's a tradition. Okay. Yes. And so I will actually, I try to visualize this. It's a very important point, because we're so used to thinking about human social groups and human evolution and everything as stemming from social cooperation between individuals, between the apes. But what this starts out from is cooperation between the ideas. So it's a purely informational thing. The sociant is a purely informational entity. So it is intricately connected to the apes, but it's not constituted by them. So I hope this will become clearer as I go on. Otherwise, we'll have to discuss it and try to tease it out somehow. So the compartments, they are isolated networks of strong social links, which are then necessary for transmission of traditions. They coincide with the communities because there is a strong in-group, out-group differentiation. Chimpanzees, I mean, the common chimpanzee, they will pretty much kill each other if they meet somebody from a different community. So that's pretty straightforward. They don't talk. Okay. Bonobos is a little bit different. They haven't been studied at all as much. So frankly, we don't know all that much about exactly how that is. But they don't intermix freely. So at the very least, there is a big difference. I mean, there is a differentiation between traditions. They demand that you are in pretty close contact. Even within communities, they spread much more easily between mothers and offspring, for example, because they will tolerate to be very close to each other. And that is what is demanded for the traditions to really spread easily.
So here, traditions are in memory.
Yes. The traditions are the colored little dots up here.
So they are not observed behavior. So you could have tacit traditions that
yes.
go on without being observed for generations.
You could have, there is no notion that they are aware of them or anything like that. It can be gestures, it can be pretty much everything that you will pick up by socially learning it from observing somebody else doing it.
So there is behavior, in reality they are not entities in memory, they are expressed.
Yes, because they have to travel somehow. I won't get into it, but there are later differences between this chimp-like thing that we can imagine here maybe, and later on, because humans, they teach and we also imitate, while chimpanzees, they tend to emulate instead. They observe that you crack nuts, for example, but they don't focus on how you do it. They focus on that you do it, and they try to come up with their own way of doing it. It's scaffolded by how others do it, but they are not that interested in it. So they recreate, and that makes them limited to transmitting traditions that they understand what they are good for, and that they are able to invent themselves. So they are limited by this. We imitate instead, which makes we are happy to learn things that we don't know what they're good for or how they work. We just repeat them. And by doing that, we can also inherit cultural knowledge that has been refined over long periods of time. So, okay, but in any case, that it spreads along social networks and so on, that is still true. So that is not affected by that. So limits the spread of traditions between communities, so they possess the same information. So this creates a little bit of a picture of what it looks like. You have these things going on, and if you look carefully at the colored dots, you will see that there is a difference in one of the colored dots. So you can have a persistent differentiation between them. So, some additional things. Now we move through time here a little bit. What happens afterwards, because we were really after being able to say something about human evolution and what happens. Okay, so we start out at the beginning. Macro level fitness is additive with regard to micro level fitness, and that simply means that all the traditions or the RNAs to begin with, they do something, they're self-contained. So imagine, for example, with the chimpanzees, they have a couple of particularly well-known traditions, food-getting traditions. Ant dipping and termite fishing and nut cracking, for example. So if you take the nut cracking tradition and then you remove it, nothing happens to the ant dipping tradition because they are completely separated. There is no interaction between them. And generally, if you look at the traditions, at the chimp traditions, they are like that. They are completely self-contained. You can pick them up at any time and you can lose them at any time. And if you lose one tradition, then all you lost was that tradition. Nothing more happens. So what is predicted to happen at a later point here is that you have these compartments, and what the compartments do is that the micro-level evolutionary individuals contained within them, they get inherited together on the macro level. So they are in the same boat. It's called that they have an alignment of fitness being imposed upon them. So if somebody tries to gain benefit at the expense of the others in the same boat, then the consequences of that will have a very short, it's called sometimes a boomerang effect, and the boomerang will have a short way to travel. It will hit it pretty quickly. So the macro level penalty in fitness will strike pretty quickly. Otherwise, if you don't have that, then you have a much more cooperation will be much more brittle because of that. You can get away with undermining what the others do. Here it's harder to get away from it, because as soon as you undermine the success of your vesicle, then you're in bad shape because you can't spread beyond it. The only way you can do that is by dividing and growing, so that's the only way you can get out. This is a perfect situation for cooperation to arise. And in this case, we're looking at cooperation between ideas. So we predict that there will be non-additive fitness arising here, that combinations of traditions will arise that will interact and together have a higher fitness. And that is also what is predicted to have happened at an early point in biological protocell evolution, that you would have systems, metabolic systems of replicators arising with the capability of doing a lot more than they could do on their own. For example, for producing more powerful enzymes that could stabilize reactions. And you could go from there. That is something that could get things started. Eventually, when things have run their course, and the macro level has been able to handle the conflicts on the micro level to a higher extent, macro level fitness might entirely supersede micro level fitness. And the micro-level components has no fitness on their own. So if you pick a part of a cell out, an organelle, it has no fitness because it doesn't do anything meaningful on its own anymore. And you can do that with a human society too. You pick out a bank, it doesn't do anything unless you connect it to the rest of society. It doesn't make any sense on its own. So you have an internal adaptive organization, which is an organismal organization arising inside of here. So this is a parallel type of organization imagined to result in both cases. In the abstract, so we'll see here what so. Okay, good. I think I have another slide later on where I have some more details on that. Okay, so internal adaptive organizational traditions then, not hominins, is the primary thing here. Pre-Homo and Pan, okay, so Pan is still like this. Collection of atomistic traditions with additive fitness on the macro level, and they just go about their business. The macro level just shadows the micro level. We're actually interested in seeing if there is macro level fitness in chimpanzee communities. There might be, nobody has looked for it. There are actually some candidates that could be group adapted also in chimpanzees, like how they organize their border patrol parties and things like that, because that differs between different regions. And it's not the usual thing in animals that you have differences, non-genetic differences in group organization, that type of heterogeneity within the groups. So now we move up to the so-called older one, which is 2.5 million years ago about. We can see that the hominins, they start behaving in a quite different way. We see the first flake, lithic flake technology arising. There are some earlier examples of lithic technology that are known now, but they are not contiguous with what we see from the older one. Because what happens in the older one, 2.5 million years ago, it is an unbroken chain all the way into our days after that. So everything that happens back then is connected to what's happening today. Okay, so what these shards, these flakes, the sharp flakes, what they were used for, so initially they were used for cutting up, for processing carcasses, for cutting up meat and tendons and stuff like that. And the thing was that during this time, okay, so the hominins, our ancestors, they were walking on two legs. They were living in open environments, savanna-like settings, wooded grassland and things like that. These types of environments were expanding around this time. They had expanded during a long period of time. The climate got cooler and cooler, and 2.56 million years ago, the Pleistocene begins and the glaciation cycles start. So you get a very variable and cool climate, and this brings along a lot of large grazing animals. So suddenly we have a lot of big packages of meat laying about in these open areas. And it's not unexpected that an extractive forager starts to try to get at carcasses in ways that are smart. I mean, that's precisely what they are doing. And that seems to be what they have been doing also. A quite surprising fact that it wasn't until quite recently that I learned about it, that obviously it's still like this, that if an elephant dies or a rhinoceros dies, that nothing out the savannas can eat it. They will just have to sit there. They can eat a trunk and things like that, but they will just have to sit there and wait until it bursts a couple of days later from putrefaction. Then they can get into it because they can't create the skin. So this would have been a deciding factor, that if you are equipped with sharp flint shards, you can actually penetrate the carcass right away. And that means you wouldn't have to chase anybody away, probably. You would have to keep them away when you got to it. But the interesting thing here, and this hasn't been very much noted in the literature really, because there is a strong focus on the individual traditions and how complex they are. What can you do? I mean, how do you make these Oldowan flakes? I mean, there is a lot of literature on that. I mean, how you do it and how smart were they and etc. and so on. But what I, from this perspective, find really striking is that, okay, you have a traditional way of producing the flakes. That's one thing. It's not terribly hard. Chimps can learn to do it more or less with some biomechanical limitations. But to do that, you need to get the raw material. You need to get the pebbles from which you do them. And they are obtained from quarries that are located on the landscape in different places. You have to know where they are. You have to be able to tell the suitable pebbles from the ones that are not suitable. So you have to be selective about it. And you have to move them from where they are to the caching places where they would be and where they would work on them. Okay, so that's the first thing. Once you have the sharp shards, they would be completely pointless unless you had a carcass to use them on. And that is, again, another domain of knowledge that you need to have. You need to be able to obtain the carcass, and you need to be able to defend the carcass, and you need to be able to use the shards, because it might not be obvious how you use the shards because you have one. So what we have here already 2.5 million years ago is a system of interacting traditions, all of which are completely pointless unless you have all the others. There is no point, I mean, you can't make shards unless you have the raw material, and there's no point in making shards unless you can use it on something. Everything is completely pointless unless you have everything at the same time here. That's a big difference from the chimpanzees. As we move on, okay, I've chosen the Middle Paleolithic here, because that is the point, and the Middle Paleolithic, I might add, it's about 300,000 years ago. It's when we tend to connect it with Neanderthals and also with early Homo sapiens lived in this way. At this time, we have domestic fire. It's universal. Becomes universal around this time. It existed locally in many places before that. We have a standardized toolbox where you have a very careful selection of raw material and you prepare cores in very particular ways so you can strike very large flakes out of them that are blanks and that are in turn turned into a variety of different tools that are specialized to be used in different ways. And you're hunting at this time they are pinpointing the strongest in the mature animals in the herds, the most nutritious ones, which no other predator are able to do. They will always try to target the weak individuals. We're going after the macrofauna, the mammoths and the rhinoceros and things like that that nobody else would even dream of trying to kill. So we have a system at this time that is extremely efficient and that can do things that no other species can do. And it can do it pretty much regardless of where on the planet it occurs also. Because at this time, Homo is represented across the whole old world. And it's creeping, at this time it is on high latitudes. At 1.8 million years ago, there was a breakout of the first out of Africa event when the hominins spread across the old world, but at low latitudes around that time. And then they spread into more and more marginal biotopes. So something made them able to adapt in a way that was completely unthinkable in any other way. So by this time we have a much tighter system of different hierarchical system of different socio-technical regimes, socio-technical components that are interacting to produce a macro level function, evolutionary function on the top level, and it becomes harder and harder to imagine that you would, one of them would be viable on its on their own or anything like that. And we also, of course, have a very strong effect on the hominins themselves. They have tripled their brain size at this time. We have language, and we have all these things that are typically macroscopic adaptations akin to regulatory functions that we find within organisms that are fairly easy to explain as top-down structures that will arise as a sort of way of regulating a machine that is adapted as a whole. But that is a lot harder to explain coming from the bottom up. Yes. So I invented a little extra word here for the purpose to talk about the idiome, all our ideas, so to speak. So actually, until fairly recently, everybody would have pretty much the same idiome within a social unit. If we look at hunter-gatherers even today, they will not have craft specialization. You don't have a particular hunter or a particular flint napper or a particular doing this or that. We have a gendered division of labor, and we have an age division of labor also, but that's pretty much everything. Then we have that certain persons will gravitate towards doing more of something, but they all learn pretty much the same thing. There is a canonical cultural suit that they learn. So here we get a little bit then into what the sociont is, how it expresses itself. So everybody has the same ideas, but they are not expressed at the same time and in the same way. So somebody does something, and it serves a sort of function relative to some other cultural knowledge that somebody else has. So they are functionally linked, but it's also networked in terms of that it can suppress and stimulate the expression of other elements of culture. So I do something, and that makes somebody else do something else, or it keeps somebody else from doing something. And you get this system going. I mean, if you have this going on dynamically, the mode in which it operates is quite similar to how you have a to genetic regulatory networks, where you will have a genome where all the cells have the same genome, but they will express different parts of it at different times, and this will regulate how others will what other parts will be expressed and in what turn they do it. That everybody has the same. That everybody has the same knowledge, has its. It might sound curious that craft specialization comes so late in prehistory. It's only about 10,000 years old. You see it when people become sedentary and you have very large populations and people get professions. So you differentiate what they learn. Because if you split up, if a sociont splits, then what happens is that you want to have some sort of guarantee that both of them will have a complete set of functions within them. And that's pretty straightforward. If everybody knows the same thing, then it doesn't matter really who goes in which offspring community. On the other hand, if they have a lot of specializations, then it becomes a puzzle to place who goes where to guarantee that you have two viable offspring going on there. It's much simpler if everybody just does the same thing. So, of course, it's solved in a different way in multicellularity, for example, where you have a single cell that is a propagule and that everything grows from. So it's served in a different way. This is more like a cell, of course. So, yet some more statements. Okay, I think this one is somewhat interesting because in the protocell, in the biotic protocell, you will have RNA molecules that will just replicate whenever they can. And this is of course conducive to competition, because you can have somebody just gaining a benefit or just starting to replicate more quicker than others and outgrowing them internally, and might upset the balance between things and so on. And in the same way, you can have, if we look at chimpanzees, they will pick up their traditions at any time and at any place, pretty much. There's no ordering between them. They don't depend on each other. You don't have to learn something first that enables you to learn something later. So they are all independent, as we said before. So that's a similarity between the protocell stage. If we look at the living system, what we end up with, I would suppose about 2.5 billion years ago, something, or 3.5 billion years ago, maybe the last universal common ancestor around that time, the earliest prokaryotes, the earliest bacteria. What has happened is that we have suddenly we have the chromosome. So all these different genetic elements that were just going on their own have become sequenced into a single structure that gets replicated once every time the cell splits. And this solves a good number of evolutionary what is it called, dilemma that you have initially with keeping micro-level competition at bay. So first of all, it's hard for so-called outlaw genes to dominate, because in order to gain access to the replication machinery, you have to introduce yourself into this sequence. It does happen. Transposons are exactly that, but it becomes a lot harder to do it. The other thing is that we can have a macro level control also over which proportions we have of genes. A couple of that type, a couple of that type, a couple of that type, and that type, and that type. So we can compose an overall mix of genes that are replicated, and so that is a very strong enabler for high-level adaptation to take place. So we have all of that arising around this time. So the interesting thing here, and I will just have a look at whether so I don't say things before I should say them. Okay. Yeah. So I'll say a lot of that there as well. Okay, yeah. It can become when you do this, you can have a machinery around it, and you can do stuff with it. So let's go to the next one. So the reason why it works at all, really, probably in the early stages, would be that, as I said before, that the learner insists on understanding why it learns something. It wouldn't just learn anything. But of course, you can still have outlaws, because you could have ideas that just find the loopholes and the weaknesses in this system that just are good at being spread in general and doesn't do anything anything beneficial. So you will have to fight that. You will, and you also have this fact that the rapid horizontal transmission makes it likely that you have a high level of mixing within the social protocell, so that when you split it, you probably get something similar in both of them. It's a high likelihood that you get. Otherwise, you would be in trouble. It probably wouldn't work at all. So when we get up to, say, the middle Paleolithic, and probably earlier, you can see, but we can be fairly sure of it around about 300,000 years ago. is that we have a canonical cultural repertoire. So it's not just haphazard anymore. We have an extended childhood, for example. So we start out with a small child, it gets introduced, and it gets, as anthropologists call it, gets culturated. You start out with simple things. This individual over time until it becomes, bit by bit in sequence, until it becomes an adult, where it is expected to have learned everything that it should learn and to be able to serve as a part of the community. And this is not subject to much randomness at all. You are really expected to learn how to be a part of a traditional society. It's hard to sneak things in, so we do see the same sequence where you get this is suggestive of that we may be solving the same macroscopic evolutionary problems here, because we get something that is very similar happening on the informational level here. And we get all the benefits that we also get in biological life, control over the overall composition of ideas, for example. And we know that the idiom will be fully present in hominin, and then it will be present also in the offspring, so that that will increase the fecundity on the macro level. So okay, so we talked about, okay, we have two separate but linked structures here. We have the social network, and then we have the ideational system, the sociont. The sociont itself is rather like an organism or a machine. You can think of like a flow chart or some organizational chart or something like that. You can't split it, it's indivisible. You can't take a part of it and it will still be viable. But the sociont still needs to divide, and the reason that it can is that the social network is divisible. So when the social network divides, you get something like a duplication of the sociont. Because if you have a high number of, say, if n is large enough, then n divided by 2 individuals will do the same thing as n individuals do if they have the same ideas in their head. So that means you can split them up, because the social network is divisible, but the sociont isn't. And that is, I mean, an important criterion for that you're able to have a higher level selection going on at all, because you can build this rigid, non-divisible system. The primordial state, the chimpanzee, for example, there you can pretty much divide it, because you can take a couple of traditions. It's just that it usually doesn't, because of how it works. Usually they aren't split up, and that's of course an important precondition for that it could get started. So this was just to illustrate what I meant by having a macroscopic structure, a macroscopic adapted structure arising. So the fitness on the macro level in the leftmost case here, with the chimpanzee case, is just an additive fitness. We just have the addition of the different things. Whereas in the early Homo case, we have a situation where there is no fitness obtained individually by the different traditions, but you have a higher fitness. You have a potentially very high fitness arising from doing all of them at the same time. And this was probably this would be a very important feature of what happened here, because we can see that it hasn't happened among the chimpanzees. They're still, I mean, in this primordial state. Nothing. I mean, if something has happened, it at least got stuck at a very low level. The differentiating thing would probably have been the availability of large packages of food in this case. Large packages of food that was somewhat cryptic and hard to get to, so that it actually pays off to invest in culturally learned strategies for dealing with it. Because if you think about it, if you start out with being a scavenger, that is then taken on to earlier and earlier access and better processing, to hunting, and all the way into industrial livestock farming today. There is an unbroken chain all the way that goes exactly through this predatory behavior. So if you don't have that, then you're not going to have any traditions that are going to be important enough to the carriers that they will have a differentiating role on the macro level. It will be too much noise in the system for anything to happen on the macro level. But at the moment that you had something that, okay, this group developed a way of using these big carcasses, that would have been a major benefit, because it's a very high quality type of food, and in the environment it would be quite dependable also, because you have grazing animals pretty much everywhere. And you would certainly gain from being better and better and better and better at it. So it would be open-ended. You could keep on adding things to this forever, pretty much. Better and better ways of making the tools more and more efficiently. You can have better and better ways of processing the food, of transporting it, of using different parts of the animal, ways of distributing the resources throughout the community. There are so many different dimensions along which this system can be improved. So you can really build something very big upon it. And actually it remains very, very central until the end of the Middle Paleolithic. And that is, depending on where you are in the world, but about 50 to 100,000 years ago, where we have the Upper Paleolithic taking place, which is often referred to as behavioral modernity, because we can recognize ourselves in the subsequent Homo sapiens that come along with use of symbolic artifacts, and they will have cave paintings and ornaments and musical instruments and things like that. They also start to tap into smaller resources, like going after rabbits and fish and fowl and tubers, and eventually into more and more plant resources. And all of these things demand that you have specialized tools, specialized strategies for doing it. So you have a very strong differentiation of system in adapting to a lot of different resources at the same time. The result is that the mobility, you have more people because you're using land more efficiently, more and more people into the same space. You have to move less and less, and eventually you don't have to move at all, and then we have sedentism arising eventually. So until this happens, until we start to fan out like this when using all sorts of different resources, humans were extremely focused on big game hunting. They would pick up stuff that they would find. They would pick up turtles and they would pick berries and do things like that. But they wouldn't hunt rabbits, they wouldn't go after fish, and they wouldn't do things like that. In a time period between 50 and 100,000 years ago, roughly in Africa, they start doing that in certain places. And that is seen as the starting point of the Upper Paleolithic coming later on. You also get these bigger polities with multiple of these chimp level communities which are face-to-face coordinated, multiple, several of these linked together in a tribal unity, which is coordinated with symbolical means and cultural kinship and things like that, that you can coordinate larger communities. But a lot of this happens before that. So you have about 2 million years earlier than that, where there's a focus on big game hunting, and you have these small, about 150, 200 people, probably somewhere around there, in a big patchwork across large parts of the planet, competing at all times, probably, because in order to cooperate, you would need institutions and ways of doing that, and there seems to be no evidence that arose before. There seems to be evidence that is precisely what arose when the Upper Paleolithic formed about 50,000 years ago. So that was probably quite hard, and usually the cooperation is quite hard to, it's not something that we do automatically. That rarely happens automatically. It was peace that was invented, not war, through that. So hominin social cooperation, when we try to understand human evolution, has always been primary. We've always started to think about apes starting to cooperate. And it's easy to think of why it would be adaptive to cooperate. But it's always harder to see how this cooperation got started. And there are, okay, so this is, if we move to macroevolutionary theory, this is familiar in one way, because there are two recognized ways of trying to understand why cooperation arises. It's called multi-level selection type 1 and multi-level selection type 2. And type 1 is a question of cooperation arising from the bottom up. So you have some sort of cooperation arising, and when you do this, you adapt to each other, and you align the fitnesses because you become dependent, and that may be a springboard to develop a little bit more cooperation, and then you go on bit by bit by bit by bit by bit, like that. And that's how human evolution has been always envisioned, that this has happened. Multi-level selection type 2, on the other hand, is what has happened every time we have had an evolutionary transition in individuality. And then what is involved is some sort of pre-adapted feature that automatically aligns the fitness from the start, and that kickstarts cooperation from begin with. And there has been absolutely nothing like that seemingly present in early human evolution. So the only way to look at it is as a type 1, multi-level selection type 1 type of trajectory. But that is known in all other cases that it doesn't lead very far. In the human case, we always have the spectacular cognitive capacities of great apes to fall back on as a fudge factor. We were smarter, so we could realize that it was good to cooperate. The problem with that, it's not implausible by any means, but it's a hazardous, because you can always, you can put any sort of explanatory shortcoming into this. We could understand that, so we are different in that way. It's not implausible, but you do get stories that are just so story-like. First this happened, and that had to happen, and that happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. So you get these long things going on like that. In a type 2 story, you have something like a protocellular structure to begin with, which explains how fitness got aligned, and how you got the structures, and how you had group level selection kicking in at an early stage, and that makes it all the much easier to explain why you have these structures happening. So by hominin cooperation, because that's of course, I mean, we cooperate very closely and very in very advanced ways, and chimps don't. I mean, they're not more cooperative than any other species. They're actually pretty bad at cooperating. So a system of ideas, a sociant that could make us cooperate and that could reduce the level of conflict between us would be better off than a sociant that couldn't do it, because it would enable them to make us behave in many more different ways. It would increase the design space of the sociant. So doing that would be tremendously adaptive. And since the sociant consists of ideas, it hardly could be better poised to do it. So we have a little Baldwin effect cycle going on here, potentially. So hominins that are able to fill their roles within the sociant, they would be favored by selection via the sociant, because the sociant could operate properly. And probably also within, because you would have policing features, and people would not like others that would not cooperate and wouldn't pull their weight, and so on. You can see traces of that even in chimpanzees, so it has probably been a quite early way of an early type of idea to nurture. And this is about how it creeps over to a genetic level over time. Not that we learn exactly potentially how to do it, but that we get constituted to behave in such a way. So as the capability of the sociant increases, or capability of the hominins increase, we get a larger brain, and we get a psychology that is more fitted to live in this system. The sociant, okay, it relaxes the system, and the sociant may stretch the capabilities again a little bit, because now it can it has a new comfort zone, so it can do something more and renews the selection pressure on the hominins, and there you go. Because something very powerful must have propelled the growth of our brains, for example, because it's I mean, even chimpanzees are outliers, so we're really outliers of outliers when it comes to the size of brains. There are other examples of highly that approaches the chimpanzee, but they have remarkably big brains. And if we go back to the Australopithecines before us, they had brains, relative brain size very similar to chimpanzees. So that was our baseline as well. So from this point of view, our cooperation would not be primary, but would be secondary. It would be the ideas that would shape our ability to cooperate. It would have primarily been in the interest of the sociant, not of ourselves. And this is a different thing that I actually took it out of the first paper on this subject, which I don't know if it has been distributed. I don't know if I sent the link or anything, but you can put it up maybe if I send it to you. It's in biological theory. It came out in the... it's assigned to an issue now, so it will probably say 2019 on it. But I took it out because it became too long and it was about too many things. But I find this quite interesting. So, because what happens to Homo, what happens to ourselves when we end up, when this sociant forms around us. I mean, first we have a community, and we are uncomplicated evolutionary individuals with behaviors that we pick up from each other, and suddenly we are immersed in a system of ideas that exist above our heads and between us, so to say. So what happens with us then? We're inside this structure in an important sense, although we are not contained by it in a physical sense, but we can't leave it, we can't live without it. Everything we do is conditioned by this structure. And so it seems like we would end up in a symbiotic ecological relationship with this sociontic type of organism. adapting to becoming essentially a part of it. We become completely dependent on it. It becomes an obligatory relationship because the sociont obviously can't live without us, and we can't live without it either. Which mostly resembles what has happened with endosymbionts in, most prevalently within the eukaryotic cell with mitochondria and plastids and things like that. That originally were bacteria, like any other bacteria, but that came to live their entire lives within another organism, adapting to it, and the organism, the host, also adapting to it, so that they become a unit over time. It has been noted, already Darwin noted a big similarity, great similarity between humans and our domesticates. That there are many parallels between domesticated animals and humans in their features. And that has been studied quite a bit. There is one tradition that are talking about human self-domestication, for example, that we have domesticated ourselves. So in this sense, we wouldn't have domesticated ourselves or anything else. The sociont would have done that to all of us. It just started very early with us, and we had a particularly central role in it, but it would be the same process. Because if you look at the domestication events, it's rare that you can trace any sort of intention by the humans to domesticate what they domesticate. It's a matter of getting closer and closer and closer and more incorporated, and which changes the morphology and the behavior of the animals or the plants or whatever it is, and suddenly it has become a part of it. So you have a cow or you have wheat or something like that. It can pretty quickly, not in all cases, but in many cases, they can't live without humans pretty quickly. They have radically different properties than the wild form that they come from. And we adapt our societies so that they fit into them as a little functional unit that will serve some specialized purpose. So compared to, then they become endosymbionts as well. They undergo the same transformation. It's just that we have an exceptional, we're like the nucleus of the social system. But it also opens up for the thing that we can see that we are not essential to the sociont in that way. If something else can serve our function in the sociont, then, well, the sociont doesn't care about that. Because from that point of view, the sociont doesn't emerge from us. The sociont engulfs us. It turns everything upside down. Instead of looking at culture as something that extends us from an outside, we are part of the whole system instead, which is a quite different way of thinking about it. And I believe that I am at the last slide eventually. So now let's see if we have any question or discussion. I don't know for how long I have kept on here, but yeah, look.
So there are two things. One of them is you have a lot of diversity. Diversity plays a big role.
Yes.
And so in this case, you emphasized always that the things are the same.
Yeah.
So this is one. And the second one is why didn't chimpanzees move in the same direction?
So I think if I start out with I can start out with the last one, then with the chimpanzees maybe. I think that once Homo got started adapting to big game hunting, we would pretty quickly have occupied the open terrain Homo didn't move into closed canopy rainforests until about 10,000 years ago. It's a terrible environment for humans to be in. Once we have lost all arboreal adaptations, we're stuck on the floor of this terrifying three-dimensional area. So we were prevented from entering their domain, so to say. And they were likely very much prevented from exiting their domain also. So they were stuck in there. And in the rainforest, what you have is a lot of small dispersed resources, which is not very conducive for using very advanced. It's hard to get this thing going unless you have some big resource that you can tap into and where you can get a lot of leverage for starting to use technology and use cultural ways of obtaining it, and that you can go on doing that. So it's hard to think of anything that they would have used a very advanced technology for doing. In most of the things that they eat, they can just pop in their mouths, pretty much. And the biggest thing that they eat are colobus monkeys, which they do hunt. So, I mean, you can see that in these rare occasions where they actually do get their hands on something a little bit bigger, they actually start to behave in a they don't seem to cooperate around it, but they coordinate their actions in how to do it. And it seems to become traditional also, that you have certain individuals who will take up after another has died and start these parties to hunt down the monkeys. And they don't share actively. It's just that the monkey body is bigger than most things, so that when they get to it and start tearing in it, they can't just eat it immediately, so everybody will start tearing at it, and in the end everybody will have gotten a little piece of it. So then it works out for everybody. If you have a big cow or something, it's very cheap to share, because you can't do it yourself anyway. So and it's worth a lot to who you share it with, but it doesn't cost you anything to share. So it's a well-known situation where cooperative strategies, which are probably central to this, could arise from. And then back to, if you're satisfied with the answer, back to the first question, why I emphasize the homogeneity, so to say. It is actually because I take the heterogeneity for granted. It's like the hard thing to achieve is the homogeneity. That's what is calling for an explanation. At least in this setting, I think it is it's homogeneity and also integration of information. But then, I mean, otherwise, I mean, sexual reproduction is usually essential for producing variation, so that you get uniqueness between different. So it's much weaker if you have clonally reproducing. You usually have to have very large populations and things like that to get anything going. In this case, I mean, what we would have been doing in the paper, I talk about it as hyper-adaptivity, just because it has been talked about hyper-cooperativity, that you have the sociont would be able to adapt to. It's just that it's not that it is adapted in itself essentially, but that it's capable to quickly realigning itself to changes. And there's a story to that also. It's something called variability selection that has been studied quite a bit for why did hominins exit Africa and why did they develop such an advanced way of life that they did. And then when you look at Africa, and we see that, okay, we have, with all likelihood, territorial hominins living across here. And we have cycles of very rapid biotope turnovers that happen. if you are able to adapt to local changes, you would have a tremendous benefit from doing that. And great apes are already quite good at doing that compared with anybody else. So it's a direction that is worth going in, because you're improving something that you're already quite good at, doing. And a macroscopically adapted sociont would be able to do this in ways that organisms could just dream of doing. So the logic there becomes that if we look at our big brains, compared to the brains of the chimpanzee or the Australopithecine, is that the proper question is, what can the body do with the brain? So what can an ape body do with the brain? How much fitness can it cram out of a larger brain? And then it seems like you end up at in the cost benefit at somewhere around where the chimpanzees are at. It doesn't pay to get smarter than that, because you can't benefit from doing smarter things than that as a separate monkey or ape. We have the same word for ape and monkey in Swedish, unfortunately, so we mix it up the whole time. It's apa, all of them. So the proper thing becomes that, well, what can the sociont, what can a social body, an ideational body like this, do with the brain? Well, it can do a lot more with the brain than an ape body can do. And hence, it can translate a larger brain into fitness much more efficiently, and hence we get much larger brains. Yeah, we could. Let's go on. Yeah, I will try to be a bit briefer than I was.
No, please. Okay. Well, I have two quick questions. One is on the same line. If I understand it correctly, we are outliers because we are significantly more cooperative with competitive, with respect to other systems. But in this case, if this balance between cooperation and competition is overwhelmed, is skewed on one side, then I would expect that the system will grow rather than split in different communities, different protocells, like in the example. Because if there is a cooperation, then there is no gain in breaking this large community.
Well, no, there's no gain. It's more of a failure, in fact, because keeping it together is hard. It's hard. It's not something that you choose to do. Well, yes, it's a competition along other axes. That if you observe the chimps, for example, it has been observed twice in the wild that it has happened. So what happens is that you get conflicts that erupt, social conflicts between them, and then you have reconciliation mechanisms with grooming and things like that. And the larger the unit becomes, the harder it becomes to keep everybody aligned, socially aligned. So there is no choice. There is no choice. If you have 2,000 chimps, even if it's adaptive, they can't keep together, because there is a conflict with the way that they are adapted to be potent as individuals. So there is no choice in the split is, at least originally, a failure. It's so you start cooperating, but you can't cooperate on any scale because it's hard to cooperate. It's
not cooperation at the issue is that the sociology the entities consist and some of those are growing, and some for some reason I haven't quite got his origin story, but I don't know why it doesn't go beyond that. The things he was calling they need to be relatively invariant, because otherwise they don't work, and they certainly don't work together. The issue is how they can work together to produce a functional system. But at some level, we get what we've done to get bigger and bigger social units is we've gotten higher and higher levels of these clusters, or whatever you call them. But what I want, and if that's true, then in some sense it's much more expandable than what he's talking about, where they're just individual, independent conditions. Then it doesn't go anywhere. But once you start getting these clusters, one thing I don't understand is, do you ever get then to, or have we ever gotten to a higher level, a higher evolutionary level than what he's calling a sociomod? Or is what you're saying the case, namely, simply somehow finding this meta capability, which is at the sociomod level, meta capability of forming larger and larger complexes of conditions, that's good enough, and so that's all incorporable. That is the hierarchical nature of the entities inside the sociomod allows you to keep going, and of course get more and more of these complicated mechanisms for dispute settling and so forth. Or you get to some point where that, whatever it is producing this hierarchical ordering of what is he calling it? Of
the parts of the social tissue, so to say, or exactly.
Is there going to be some level, or is there already been some level in which a whole new level of evolutionary individuality has arisen above socion, which we can equate with what we think of as society? I think of society as composed by the rules of behavior, as it were, these traditions. Is there a higher level of society? And in some ways we see as politically groping for something like that and failing constantly, like Europe or the United Nations, something like that. But that's only in terms of the organization levels that we can understand. Could it be that there are organization levels that we can't, even we just have to operate with our brain, that we just can't see? And it's organizing things at higher and higher levels than what he's calling the social. That's, it seems to me that's quite conceivable.
That's right. One thing I think is that any they would ever rise at a very late point. In this context, like a couple of thousand years or something like that, which would make them very untested compared to what we had before. Very prone to that there would be some sort of malfunction that would turn up a little bit later, and everything would turn out to be unstable. Like we can say, okay, so you have the tribal thing going on with cultural kinship and symbolical coordination. So you don't have to know everybody, but you have a way of telling in-group from out-group still, and you have a way of telling how you ought to be acting towards somebody else. And it can build a larger society. Okay, so then we get religions. I mean, when you get to empires, so we can align even culturally very diverse unit by saying that.
Higher and higher kind of operational rules.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of organization.
Yeah.
It's just more levels higher.
Exactly. So, but the only thing we do when we do that is, okay, we coordinate these, and then we get everybody together in a big army, and then we kick the asses of these guys over here. There is no testing that it actually works more long term. It's just that we could do something with it over a couple of 100 years or something like that. That's everything that it has proven, really. It hasn't proven itself that it could stand for and handle its, like we can see all the main institutions and things like we move from different ways of sanctioning power and things like that, and then it turns out that there is a malfunction in the whole thing somewhere. We have democracy, and then we see that, well, that can turn out badly for minorities. Okay, so then we have a liberal democracy with a constitution and the constitutional rights and things like that. Okay, that patches it a little bit. And now it seems like we may have other malfunctions even to the liberal democracy that is turning up again.
As kind of attempts within the socion to create a higher level entity.
Yeah, and yes, I think so. Yeah, and we have, I mean, and from Enlightenment, I mean, you can see, I mean, Plato and the classical Greeks, I mean, started to think a bit about how do we design a society, a good society, but then it didn't kick off at all, I mean, until Enlightenment. Okay, let's build like a machine, a society that will be good for us inside, imagining that the society was from the beginning meant to be good for us, which it seems like it might not have been. It's a big misunderstanding. And it mixes up two abilities. One is something that we're tremendously good at, and that is building machines and building tools and coming up with solutions to concrete problems we have in front of us. We're exceptionally good at that. We travel to the moon and we can go build all sorts of things. But we actually have a pretty bad track record when it comes to building societies, I would say. And some catastrophic failures also when we try to do it. We come up with an utopian way of this is how it will work, and we'll implement it, and it implodes into total disaster and genocides and everything like that. And a lot of that has happened only in the course of a couple of hundreds of years. Which sort of to me demonstrates that it's not as easy as we imagine it to be, even if we don't imagine it to be very easy.
We have a last question, and then we have to go.
As much as the interesting this theory is, my question is it just a framework with which you try to describe a complex system, or it has been employed to actually make a prediction about how a complex system will behave from a certain point in time on, and so effectively as a predicting system.
It's
in network theory, network science, and so on.
Well, it's a framework, but it's a quite tight framework. It's very new, so I haven't been able to do all that much. I haven't had time to do that, but it does make quite specific predictions. If you compare with, other ideas for how to frame human evolution, which has been like niche construction theory, for example. The problem there is that it's very hard to say, so you can look at something and say that, oh, but that's not niche construction. It's very hard to falsify the idea that everything is niche construction, because any complex stuff around you could be niche construction. So it just confirms itself the whole time, and it doesn't constrain what you can say very much. Here you can say that, okay, if this is true, then we should see an integration of information, and it should look roughly like this, and we can go looking for it. Something that corresponds to the formation of a chromosome. It probably won't look like a chromosome because it doesn't work like that, but it will be functional equivalent in some specific ways. So it will say things like that. Which makes it falsifiable, really, I would say. You can say that it's wrong. I haven't been able to convince myself that it is wrong so far, and it's probably maximally half right, like all things like that, or it might at least be conducive for thinking about things in a different way. And there are some axes, and one is the idea that we might be looking under the wrong light pole when we are starting from cooperation between apes to begin with. That there is another way of looking at it. That's surely one thing. And that the ordering between, that the sociont goes first. I mean, there is something mildly off-putting in thinking about societies as organisms, because we have always used that as a metaphor, and it has always been known to be a loose metaphor. So when I come and say that, no, it actually is an organism, then people say, that sounds like a pretty old-fashioned way of thinking about it. Same idea. There's a specific reason for saying that it's exactly an organism, or that it actually started out as an organism at least. So it's different, but I notice that some people will frown on the idea that, look, oh, organism, yeah, it's like, people have said that for a long time. But there's a difference, okay.
So
No?
we say thank you again.
And I will send a link to the paper and everything, so then it might explain things. There are a couple of more papers coming out also, but that might take a little bit, a little time. So, I see. So that's... Den var flera timmar lång.